The German pilots laughed the first time they saw it. A bulky flying boat lumbering across the Atlantic skies, slower than most bombers, and armed with nothing more than a handful of depth charges. To them it looked like a relic, an oversized seaplane that could hardly defend itself against a determined fighter, let alone threaten the pride of the Kriegsmarine, its deadly U-boat wolfpacks. They mocked it as America's flying bathtub, a clumsy patrol craft with no place in modern warfare. But what the Luftwaffe dismissed with derision, the U-boat captains would come to fear like a nightmare. For the consolidated PBY Catalina had something no fighter ace could measure in speed or glamour. It had patience. This ungainly giant could stay aloft for 18, sometimes 24 hours, gliding endlessly over the grey Atlantic, searching, listening, waiting. It was a hunter, not of glory, but of certainty, and when it found its prey, it never let go. Night after night, convoys ploughed through the stormy seas, haunted by invisible wolves beneath the waves. And night after night, the Catalinas soared above them, silent sentinels with radar eyes and blinding searchlights. The same German officers who once sneered at this flying boat would later scribble in their war diaries words of disbelief and dread. Das Flugboot ist überall. The flying boat is everywhere. What began as ridicule soon turned to shock. By 1943, these slow, watchful machines had closed the infamous Atlantic Gap and turned the tide of the U-boat war. The same pilots who laughed realized too late that the PBY Catalina was no joke, it was the beginning of their end. In the early years of World War II, the Battle of the Atlantic was nothing less than a fight for the survival of Britain. Every loaf of bread, every shell, every gallon of fuel depended on the endless stream of convoys crossing the North Atlantic from North America. Yet between 1939 and 1942, those convoys sailed through a killing ground. German U-boats prowled the sea lanes like hungry wolves, coordinated into lethal wolfpacks that could descend on a convoy and tear it apart in a single night. For the men at sea, the ocean was not just vast, it was haunted. The British called it the air gap, a stretch of ocean in the mid-Atlantic where land-based patrol aircraft could not reach. In those lonely waters, beyond the protective shadow of Britain's coastal command or Newfoundland's outposts, convoys were naked prey. For Germany's Kriegsmarine, this was their hunting ground, and they exploited it with brutal efficiency. Between 1940 and 1942, the U-boats unleashed what became known as the Happy Times. Entire convoys were shredded. Freighters burned in the night, while desperate escorts tried and failed to fend off torpedoes striking from the dark. By early 1943, the tonnage war seemed nearly lost. Allied shipping was being sunk faster than new ships could be built. But what the U-boat commanders could not yet see was the looming shadow of American industry and innovation. In the shipyards of the United States, Liberty ships rolled off assembly lines faster than U-boats could sink them. And in the hangars of Consolidated Aircraft, a strange, ungainly patrol plane was waiting to prove its worth. The PBY Catalina, a twin-engine flying boat introduced in the 1930 seconds, had never been designed for glory. It was built for endurance, for patience, for the long, lonely watch over open seas. Its cruising speed barely touched 125 knots, and it carried only a few machine guns for defense. But what it had was range more than 2,500 miles and stamina flights lasting 18, sometimes 24 hours. At first, the Catalina's contribution was modest. Early in the war, Royal Air Force Coastal Command and U.S. Navy squadrons used them for convoy, escort, and reconnaissance. Crews would lift off from windswept harbors in Iceland, Newfoundland, or the Caribbean, their black-painted hulls rising heavily from the surf. Once airborne, they became ghostly guardians circling convoys by day, sweeping radar beams across the waves by night. Their orders were clear: find the wolfpacks, force them under, and deny them the ability to attack in numbers. The Germans scoffed. To Luftwaffe pilots, the Catalina looked like a lumbering target, an outdated seaplane better suited to the interwar years. But to U-boat crews, the Catalina quickly became a terror. For while the boat could dive and hide from destroyers, it could not escape the patience of a plane that circled above, radioing its position hour after hour. A single sighting report from a Catalina could summon an entire escort group, or worse, a hunter-killer task force. By 1942, PBY squadrons were operating from Iceland, Greenland, Newfoundland, and even deep into the Caribbean and South Atlantic. Their presence began to close the deadly air gap. In Brazil, U.S. Navy squadrons like VP-83 flew Catalinas on missions lasting nearly an entire day, patrolling the coastlines where U-boats tried to intercept oil tankers bound for Allied ports. In one astonishing month, January 943 VP-83 destroyed 2 U-boats, U-164 and U-507, within days of each other. But the true genius of the Catalina lay not just in its endurance but in its adaptability. As radar technology improved, Catalinas were outfitted with ASV air-to-surface vessel radar, enabling them to detect U-boats at night or through fog. Some were modified with powerful searchlights known as Leigh Lights, which could suddenly illuminate a U-boat caught on the surface. Imagine the terror. A U-boat captain surfacing in the dead of night to recharge batteries only to be blinded by a searing beam from the darkness above, followed instantly by the splash and roar of depth charges raining down. This was no longer just reconnaissance. The Catalina had become a weapon. For the Allies, every sighting mattered. A Catalina forcing a U-boat to dive might not sink it, but it could prevent the submarine from attacking. And a submerged U-boat cut off from its radio network was nearly useless. Over time, the cumulative effect was devastating. Wolfpacks could no longer mass against convoys, and the deadly happy times began to fade. By mid-1943, with the addition of bases in the Azores, the last gap in the Atlantic was finally closed. Now convoys were under constant watch from the air. The once invulnerable hunting ground had become a killing ground for the hunters themselves. The statistics told the story. U-boat losses skyrocketed, with dozens destroyed in a matter of months. Admiral Karl Dönitz, architect of the Wolfpack strategy, would later admit that his submarine force had been defeated not by destroyers alone, but by aircraft, the very flying boats that his men had mocked. The irony was bitter. The Germans had laughed at the sight of the PBY Catalina, dismissing it as slow and obsolete. Yet it was this unglamorous patrol plane, with its long wings, its watchful crews, and its endless patience, that changed the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. The convoys survived, Britain endured, and the tide of war shifted. And behind every victory there was the silhouette of a flying boat skimming low over the waves, a reminder that in war, endurance could be deadlier than speed. By early 1942, the Atlantic had become a graveyard for merchant ships. Convoys burned on the horizon, and the U-boats seemed unstoppable. Yet quietly, the Catalinas were beginning to change the rhythm of the war. Their first great victories came not in pitched battles, but in relentless grinding patrols that denied the U-boats their greatest advantage: surprise. Take, for example, the case of U-464, a Type 14 milchkuh, or milk cow, designed to refuel U-boats in the open ocean. These supply submarines were the lifeblood of the Wolfpacks, allowing them to stay at sea for weeks far from their bases in France. On the 20th of August 1942, a Catalina from Patrol Squadron VP 73 sighted U-464 north of Iceland. The German crew must have thought they were safe. After all, they were hundreds of miles from any surface escort. But the Catalina circled patiently, calling in its position, dropping depth charges, and harassing the submarine until British warships arrived. With no escape, the Germans scuttled their own vessel. One milk cow lost meant dozens of U-boats would go hungry. This was the pattern that would define the Catalinas' war. They were not glamorous dogfighters, they were not fast, but they were merciless in their persistence. A Catalina could loiter above a convoy all day, scanning the horizon. When its radar picked up a blip, the crew sprang into action, diving low, marking the submarine with flares or smoke, then circling until reinforcements arrived. Even if they failed to sink the U-boat outright, the submarine was forced under batteries, drained crew exhausted. Hours spent submerged meant hours lost in pursuit of merchant ships. The Germans were stunned at how far the reach of these flying boats extended. In the Caribbean, where U-boats once feasted on oil tankers sailing from Venezuela and Trinidad, Catalinas began to appear like phantoms. U.S. Navy squadrons VP-83 and VP-94 hunted tirelessly from Brazil to Puerto Rico. In January 1943 alone, VP-83 struck a devastating blow, first sinking U-164 on the 6th of the month, then U-507 just a week later on the 13th. The loss of U-507 was particularly bitter. It had been responsible for the slaughter of dozens of Brazilian ships in 1942, killing more than 600 civilians. Its destruction by a Catalina was both tactical victory and poetic justice. These victories built a rhythm of psychological warfare. Crews aboard U-boats began to write about the sense of being hunted from above. One diary entry described the Catalina as a shadow with endless wings always circling. Another noted how terrifying it was to be forced to crash dive in daylight, knowing that when the submarine surfaced again hours later, the flying boat might still be there waiting. Technological improvements amplified the terror. By late 1942, many Catalinas carried ASV radar sets which could detect a surfaced submarine at ranges of several miles, even at night or in fog. Combined with the Leigh Light, an intense searchlight mounted beneath the wing, the Catalina could suddenly pierce the darkness, blinding a U-boat captain and freezing his crew in panic. The pattern became all too familiar: a blacked-out night, the calm hiss of the sea, then suddenly a blinding beam of white light and the thunder of depth charges. Survivors often reported the shock as unbearable. The sky itself had turned against them. The endurance of the Catalina was its deadliest weapon. Where a fighter might sortie for 2 hours, the PBY could roam for 20. Crews rotated shifts, some men sleeping on the hard floor as others kept watch. They packed sandwiches, thermoses of coffee, even cigarettes to sustain themselves during the endless hours. The airplane became a second home, a cramped, oil-smelling cocoon, where men lived, fought, and sometimes died together. It was monotonous, yes, but it was also deadly effective. The statistics were beginning to add up. By forcing U-boats to submerge Catalinas, slashed the efficiency of wolfpack tactics. A submarine that once might have coordinated with half a dozen others now found itself isolated, cut off by radio silence and low battery. Merchant losses began to decline, convoy survival rates improved, and the once-invincible U-boats began to look vulnerable. For the Allies, the PBY's early triumphs were proof of concept. If a handful of slow, awkward flying boats could sink submarines and bottle up wolfpacks, what might be achieved with more squadrons, more radar, more coordination? The stage was being set for 1943, the year the hunters would become the hunted. And the German pilots who had once laughed at the flying bathtub now began to receive reports from the Atlantic U-boat after U-boat lost missions, aborted convoys, slipping through untouched. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, a Catalina was circling, and it would not leave until the wolves were gone. By mid-1943, the war in the Atlantic had shifted. The Allies were no longer on the defensive. They were beginning to choke the U-boat menace with a combination of technology, coordination, and relentless air coverage. At the heart of this transformation stood the PBY Catalina. Once derided as obsolete, the ungainly flying boat had become the eyes, ears, and claws of the convoy routes. The critical change was the closing of the infamous air gap. For years, there had been a stretch of ocean in the mid-Atlantic where no land-based aircraft could patrol, leaving convoys exposed. U-boat captains called it their paradise. But in late 1943, with the establishment of bases in the Azores, the Catalinas and other long-range patrol aircraft filled the void. Suddenly, there was no safe zone left. Whether in the icy waters of the North Atlantic or the tropical expanse of the South Atlantic, a convoy was rarely unprotected. The wolves had nowhere left to hunt. The new role of the Catalina was not just to patrol, but to direct entire battles. When a PBY's radar picked up a contact, the crew would shadow it for hours, sending constant updates by radio. Convoy escorts, destroyers, corvettes, or even escort carriers could then converge on the submarine's location. The Catalina became the conductor of a deadly orchestra, keeping the U-boat pinned beneath the waves until heavier firepower arrived. In many cases, the flying boat itself made the kill. In others, it played the indispensable role of holding the enemy in place, guiding the final blow. One example came in the Caribbean theatre. In July 1943, VP 74's Catalinas tracked U-134 for hours, forcing it to stay submerged until its batteries and air grew dangerously low. When the U-boat finally surfaced in desperation, it was caught in a trap pounded by depth charges until it disappeared beneath the waves. This was the pattern repeated across the Atlantic, relentless air patrols that turned the ocean from a predator's domain into a killing field for the hunters themselves. Psychology played a huge role. U-boat crews had once emerged at night confident in the cover of darkness, but with radar and Leigh Lights mounted on Catalinas, the night was no longer safe. Survivors described the horror of suddenly being illuminated by a blinding beam of light, followed by the shriek of diving engines and the thunder of explosions. Even if they escaped, the stress was immense. Crews wrote of sleepless nights of jumping at every distant hum in the sky, convinced it was a Catalina stalking them. Morale plummeted, and Admiral Donitz himself acknowledged the fear. The Atlantic is becoming an air ocean. The numbers proved it. Between January and May, 1,943 alone Allied aircraft were responsible for destroying dozens of U-boats, and Catalinas played a central role in many of these victories. In the South Atlantic, VP-94 and VP-83 hammered U-boats along the Brazilian coast, cutting the lifeline of oil and raw materials bound for Germany. In the North Atlantic, British and American Catalinas patrolled from Iceland and Newfoundland, bottling up the approaches to Britain. Even in the Indian Ocean, Catalinas played their part guarding supply lines to India and the Middle East. The reach of this flying boat was global. One of the most dramatic encounters came with U-199 off Brazil in July 1943. After being spotted by a Catalina, the U-boat fought back with heavy anti-aircraft fire, hitting the flying boat and wounding crew members. But the Catalina pressed the attack, dropping depth charges that crippled the submarine. Other aircraft joined the fight, and within hours, U-199 was destroyed. Survivors bobbed in the water as the Catalinas circled above, proof that even a well-armed U-boat could not escape the long reach of Allied patrol planes. By this stage of the war, the German U-boat fleet was bleeding out. In May 1943 alone, later called Black May, the Germans lost 41 submarines, a staggering rate that could not be sustained. Many of those losses were directly tied to aircraft patrols, with Catalinas often serving as the first to spot and strike. The grim arithmetic became undeniable. The wolfpack strategy was no longer viable. For every convoy intercepted, several U-boats were being lost. By the summer, Donitz was forced to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic, effectively conceding the battle. What made the Catalina's success so remarkable was how unlikely it seemed at the start. It was not fast, not glamorous, not bristling with guns, but it was steady, persistent, and everywhere at once. It was a plane that made the ocean smaller, shrinking the spaces where the enemy could hide. Each mission, flown each hour, spent scanning the horizon, eroded the power of the U-boat fleet. To the Allies, the Catalina became a symbol of endurance and quiet victory. To the Germans, it became a phantom in the sky, a reminder that the Atlantic was no longer theirs. Every sighting, every forced dive, every sudden flare in the night pushed the U-boats further toward defeat. The laughter that once greeted the flying boat had long since vanished, replaced by a chilling respect and fear. By the end of 1943, the PBY Catalina had helped turn the tide of the Atlantic War. It was not alone. Destroyers, code breakers, and escort carriers all played their parts, but without the tireless flying boats, the convoys might never have survived. The ungainly PBY had proven the old saying true in war: sometimes patience kills more surely than speed. The spring of 1943 marked the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. For the Allies, it was the moment when years of endurance, innovation, and sacrifice finally came together. For the German U-boat force, it was the beginning of the end. And woven throughout this drama was the PBY Catalina, the flying boat that had once been ridiculed, now transformed into the silent reaper of the Atlantic. Imagine the scene: a grey morning over the North Atlantic, May 1943. Convoy ONS 5 was steaming westward, 42 merchant ships, heavily laden with supplies for North America. Waiting for them in the deep were more than 40 German U-boats, the largest wolfpack yet assembled. Admiral Donitz had thrown everything he had into the fight, desperate for a victory to turn the tide. For days the submarines stalked the convoy, diving and surfacing, preparing to strike in waves. But the Allies were ready. Among the sentinels watching overhead were PBY Catalina, scanning the ocean with radar, listening with their radios, hunting. One Catalina from a Royal Canadian Air Force squadron picked up the faint radar echo of a surfaced U-boat late one night. The crew, exhausted after nearly 12 hours in the air, snapped to life. "Contact the navigator," whispered. The pilot eased the flying boat down through the clouds, wings creaking, the engines droning like a heartbeat. Below, the unsuspecting submarine plowed through the waves, charging its batteries. In an instant, the Catalina dropped flares that bathed the sea in an eerie orange glow. A second later, the blinding beam of the Leigh Light cut through the darkness, locking onto the submarine like a divine spotlight. Panic erupted on the U-boat's deck. Crewmen scrambled for the deck gun while others tried to crash dive, but it was too late. The Catalina roared in low, releasing 4 depth charges in a perfect pattern around the diving boat. Columns of water rose like towers, then collapsed in thunder. Oil and debris surfaced. The Catalina circled, reporting the kill to the convoy escorts before banking off to resume its endless vigil. One more predator removed from the sea. This was only one of dozens of encounters during ONS-5. Over the course of 10 days, escorts and aircraft, Catalinas, Sunderlands, and Liberators pounded the wolfpack mercilessly. By the end, 13 U-boats were sunk, and the convoy arrived safely. For the first time, the hunters had become the hunted. Donitz himself later admitted that ONS the 5th of March ked the moment when his U-boat arm was broken. Catalinas played a central role in these victories. Their endurance allowed them to shadow U-boats for hours, guiding destroyers onto the target. Their radar and searchlights made the night unsafe. And their depth charges, though crude compared to later weapons, were devastating when delivered at the right moment. In battle after battle, the pattern repeated: a Catalina sighting, a desperate dive, a final roar of explosions. Consider the case of U-199 lurking off the coast of Brazil in July 1943. It was one of the few Type 9 boats still attempting to prowl far from Europe. A U.S. Navy Catalina from VP 74 spotted it near Rio de Janeiro. The German captain fought back fiercely, raking the flying boat with anti-aircraft fire and wounding crew members. Yet the Catalina pressed its attack, dropping depth charges that crippled the submarine. Other aircraft joined in, and within hours, U-199 was gone. Survivors floated in the wreckage, stunned that a lumbering flying boat had sealed their fate. The climax of the Catalina's campaign was not just in single kills, but in its ability to transform the battlefield. By May 1943, U-boat losses reached catastrophic levels: 41 submarines destroyed in 1 month. Many of these were sunk or crippled thanks to aircraft patrols, with Catalinas acting as the vanguard. No longer could the wolfpacks gather in the mid-Atlantic. No longer could submarines surface freely at night. The ocean had become a graveyard for them, and the air ocean had become an American and Allied domain. German pilots who once mocked the Catalina from their cockpits now heard stories from downed submarine crews of endless hours forced underwater, of sudden lights and explosions of convoys that slipped away untouched. One U-boat officer described it bluntly: "Everywhere we went, the flying boat was there. We were hunted like rats." The drama of 1943 was the culmination of years of persistence. The Catalinas were not the sleek fighters that captured headlines. They were not the massive bombers that leveled cities. But in their quiet, patient way, they decided the outcome of the longest campaign of the war. The moment the convoy battle turned, when Britain's survival and the Allied invasion of Europe were secured, it was the PBY Catalina that had been circling above, unseen but decisive. From the cold skies over Iceland to the sun-scorched coasts of Brazil, from the storm-lashed Azores to the Caribbean's turquoise waters, the Catalinas had fought their war not in minutes but in hours, sometimes in days. Each long patrol, each sighting, each kill was a thread in the tapestry of victory, and in the spring of 1943, that tapestry finally came together in a thunderous climax that broke the back of the U-boat threat forever. The wreckage of U-boats littered the Atlantic by late 1943. Oil slicks spread across the waves, lifeboats drifted aimlessly with stunned survivors, and convoy after convoy arrived intact at British ports. The laughter that German pilots once directed at the PBY Catalina had vanished. In its place was fear, disbelief, and eventually resignation. The flying boat had helped tip the scales in the most decisive battle of the seas. The aftermath of the Catalina's campaign was staggering. Between 1939 and 1945, the Allies destroyed more than 780 German U-boats. Aircraft were responsible for a significant portion of these kills, and among those the Catalinas stood out. Squadrons like VP-83, VP-94, VP-73 and RCAF's number 162 earned reputations as U-boat killers. Their slow, methodical patrols strangled the wolfpacks not with spectacle, but with suffocation. Each forced dive meant hours wasted, each lost milk cow crippled dozens of submarines, and each kill chipped away at the aura of invincibility the Kriegsmarine once boasted. The strategic impact cannot be overstated. Britain survived because the convoys survived. Without food, fuel, and munitions from America, the island would have starved or surrendered. Without secure sea lanes, Operation Torch in North Africa, Operation Husky in Sicily, and eventually Operation Overlord on the beaches of Normandy would have been impossible. Every tank that rolled into Tunisia, every bomber that lifted off from English airfields, every loaf of bread baked in London owed its existence to convoys, and those convoys owed their survival to watchful eyes in the sky. The Catalina was among the most vigilant. For the Germans, the collapse of the U-boat campaign was devastating. In 1942, Admiral Dönitz had dreamed of strangling Britain into submission, calculating that if his submarines could sink 7,000,000 tons of shipping per month, victory was possible. And for a brief moment he came close. But by mid-1943 his dream was shattered. Losses skyrocketed to unsustainable levels. May 1943 alone cost him 41 submarines, nearly a quarter of his operational fleet. No navy, no matter how skilled, could endure that rate of attrition. The wolves had been hunted to extinction, and the war at sea shifted irreversibly in favor of the Allies. The psychological toll was just as severe. Diaries of U-boat crews captured after the war reveal men broken not just by depth charges but by exhaustion. They wrote of nights haunted by the sudden glare of a Leigh light, of the eerie hum of a Catalina circling above like a phantom. Das Flugboot ist überall, one survivor, scribbled, "It is everywhere." They felt hunted, cornered, and doomed. What had begun as a campaign of terror against Allied shipping ended as a nightmare for the hunters themselves. The Catalina's legacy extended far beyond 1945. Its success proved the decisive value of long-range maritime patrol aviation. Before the war, many naval strategists dismissed such aircraft as auxiliaries useful, perhaps for reconnaissance but not for combat. The PBY rewrote that assumption. Its combination of range, sensors, and endurance became the blueprint for future patrol planes, the Lockheed Neptune, the P-3 Orion, and eventually the Boeing P-8 Poseidon. Even today, the concept of a patient, long-legged aircraft sweeping the seas for submarines owes its lineage to the ungainly PBY. The aircraft itself lived on in surprising ways. After the war, hundreds of Catalinas were sold into civilian service. They carried passengers, ferried cargo, fought wildfires as water bombers, and even served in smaller air forces around the world for decades. Yet wherever they flew, their silhouette carried a weight of history. For veterans of the Atlantic convoys, the sight of a Catalina low on the horizon was not merely reassurance, it was salvation. Perhaps the most profound meaning of the Catalina's story lies in its lesson: wars are not always won by speed, glamour, or raw firepower. Sometimes they are won by endurance, patience, and the quiet determination of ordinary men flying an extraordinary plane. The PBY Catalina was not beautiful. It was not fast, but it was relentless, and in that relentlessness lay victory. When historians speak of the great machines of World War II, they often mention the Spitfire, the Mustang, or the B-17. Yet ask a merchant sailor who survived the crossing of the Atlantic, and many will tell you of a different savior. They will speak of the long-winged shadow that circled overhead, of the flares that lit up the sea, of the depth charges that silenced the predators. They will speak of the flying boat. In the end, the German pilots who once mocked America's flying bathtub were forced to confront the truth. The Catalina had done what few believed possible. It found every U-boat. It held them down, and it turned the tide of the Atlantic. Without it, Britain might have starved, the convoys might have failed, and the war might have taken a darker course. With it, the road to victory over Nazi Germany remained open. The story of the PBY Catalina is the story of how ridicule turned to fear, how patience triumphed over pride, and how a slow, awkward flying boat became one of the most decisive weapons of the Second World War.